Hey everybody, this video is called You're Arrogant Dude, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, where we're going to look at Elihu tell Job that he's arrogant to dispute God's integrity. And we'll see Elihu will address Job and his accusers in misrepresenting Job's remarks. So Job chapter 34 verse 1 through 9, and this video might be a little bit long, says, Elihu further answered and said, Hear my words, you wise men. Give ear to me, you who have knowledge. For the ear tests words, as the palate tastes food. Let us choose justice for ourselves. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity, and walks with wicked men? For he has said, It profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. So Elihu, he addressed by quoting Job directly, and he claimed that Job claimed to be sinlessly perfect. And Job never claimed that. He acknowledged his sins, such as seen back in Job chapter 7 verse 21 and Job 13 verse 26. And Elihu, he accused Job of having uncontrollable tendency to expose himself to ridicule by maintaining his innocence while suffering as he was. And Elihu, he says to Job that his accusations against God render his speech and outlook indistinguishable from those of the wicked. And in verse 9, Elihu was incorrect, as he said, For he has said, It profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. He was putting words in verse 9 into Job's mouth that Job did not stutter. And Job had repeatedly argued that God treats the righteous and the wicked alike back in Job chapter 9 verse 22, Job 21:17, and Job chapter 24. In verse 10 through 15 it says, Therefore listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, from the Almighty to commit iniquity. For he repays man according to his work, and he makes man to find a reward according to his way. Surely God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice. Who gave him charge over the earth? Or who has appointed him over the whole world? If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish, and man would return to dust. So Elihu, in verses 10 through 15, he reminds Job that God is too holy to do anything wrong and is fair and dealing with people. And he's arguing to Job that God is powerful. And he says no one is really innocent. So God denies no one justice. And for the next 21 verses, we're going to see Elihu expounds this theme. And in moments of extreme stress, Job practically said the opposite of verse 10, Far be it from God that he should do wickedness. And because God doesn't depend on anyone for his status, he is sovereign and necessarily in the right. And Elihu is right that God continual common grace is necessary for any of his creatures to continue to exist. However, the survival of any individual or humanity as a whole isn't a matter of just recompense for their deeds, but is grounded in God's inscrutable purposes. And Elihu, he followed the belief, you always reap what you sow. And you probably hear that often. You hear of people saying the word karma, what goes around comes around, whatever you want to phrase it. So Elihu, he held to the belief you reap what you sow. That was promoted by Eliphaz earlier back in the book of Job chapter 4 verse 7 through 11. And Elihu, he wanted to emphasize the idea of God's independence and supremacy in verse 14 and 15. And he wanted Job to remember that God was so mighty that Job was entirely wrong to question God at all. In verse 16 through 20, it says, "If you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. Should one who hates justice govern? Will you condemn him who is most just? Is it fitting to say to a king, you are worthless, and to nobles, you are wicked? And yet he is not partial to princes, nor does he regard the rich more than the poor. For they all are the work of his hands. In the moment they die, in the middle of the night, the people are shaken and pass away. The mighty are taken away without a hand." So God is just and impartial. And Elihu took Job's agonized cries to God as Job condemning God. That's how he interpreted Job. And Elihu's really wordy at emphasizing what a perfect, just God we have, the perfect justice of God. And verse 21 through 30 says, "For his eyes are on the ways of man, and he sees all his steps. There is no darkness nor shadow of death where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. For he need not further to consider a man, that he should go before God in judgment. He breaks in pieces mighty men without enquiry, and sets others in their place. Therefore he knows their works, he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. He strikes them as wicked men in the open sight of others, because they have turned their back from him, and would not consider any of his ways, so that they caused the cry of the poor to come to him. For he hears the cry of the afflicted. When he gives quietness, who then can make trouble? And when he hides his face, who then can see him? Whether it is against a nation or man alone, that the hypocrite should not reign, lest people be ensnared." So the bulk of the second speech is a defense of God's goodness and the justice of God. And we can all agree that God is omniscient, that God is all-knowing, the judge of all, the sovereign one who does as he wills to prevent evil. And God does act to prevent the godless from overturning his sovereign purpose. And I strongly believe that mankind is not as wicked as we could be. And in verse 23, "Go before God in judgment," don't refer to the judgment of the last days, but rather a general accountability toward God that man experiences on a daily basis. And the point that Elihu made was that God did not need to go throughout all the trappings of the court to get to the sentence. And God knows their works. And in verse 29, it said, "And when he gives quietness, who then can make trouble? And when he hides his face, who then can see him? Whether it is against a nation or a man alone." So verse 29 is a difficult verse that seems to deal with Job's complaint by a certain God is acting as judge, even though to human perception he is quiet and he hides his face. And Elihu's message really to Job was clear, that God always does right. In verse 31 through 33, it says, "For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastening, I will offend no one? Teach me what I do not see. If I have iniquity, I will do no more. Should he repay it according to your terms? Just because you disavow it. You must choose and not I. Therefore speak what you know." So God won't be regulated in his dealings by what men may think. And he doesn't consult men. And if he chooses to chasten he will decide when it is enough. And God is the judge, and he is the one who issues the punishment. In verse 34 through 37, it says, "Men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. And so Elihu, he closes with another condemnation of Job's words and a call for repentance. And apparently Elihu was convinced that Job hadn't had enough chastening because of how he answered those who were prosecuting him. And he continued to defend his innocence and speak to God. And he accused Job of acting disrespectfully to the wise by clapping his hands in mockery to silence them and by making lengthy accusations against God. And Elihu, he thought that Job was getting himself deeper and deeper in his sin, but we all know that Job's troubles weren't because of anything that he did on his part. It was a heavenly realm where God and Satan are having a divine purpose. And in Job 1 and 2, we see that Job is called blameless and upright man. And so, Job, he spoke from the pain of his crisis in the presence of his friends who misunderstand him. And Elihu, he ends the chapter by one more time rebuking Job with very stern severity that exceeds even that of his friends, we see. So to wrap up today's video, we look tonight at Elihu denouncing Job for losing faith and denying God's justice. And we see that the chapter opened with Elihu inaccurately summarizing Job's arguments. And in verse 10 through 15, it shows the righteousness of God and his moral order. And many people today believe the idea that Elihu and Eliphaz held to, believing it is absolute spiritual law instead of a general principle that you will always reap what you sow. And I want to go over to Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Galatians 6:7, it says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap." So it's important to understand when you want to take Galatians 6:7, you need to understand the context of the Apostle Paul's statement. And the Apostle Paul, he was encouraging and exhorting Christians to give materially for the support of their ministers. And when you read Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, Paul's not promoting some kind of spiritual karma that teaches that you'll receive good when you do good or always receive bad when you do bad things. That's not what Galatians 6:7 is about. And if that was such absolute spiritual law, what people call spiritual karma, and they use that verse, you reap what you sow, for everything. If it was absolute spiritual law, it would surely damn us all. And the Apostle Paul was simply using the principle of sowing and weeping to a way of speaking on managing our resources before the Lord. And the Apostle Paul even used the same picture in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6 through 10 says, "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work, as it is written, He has dispersed abroad, He has given to the poor, and His righteousness endures forever. Now may He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed which you have sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness." So verse 16 through 20 showed us that God preserves His moral order. And verse 21 through 30 shows the perfection of God's judgments. And verse 31 through 33 Elihu gives strong advice to Job for what he should have said. And the chapter ends with Job's multiplied sins alleged by Elihu's ripe of God's judgment. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next, as we'll be looking at Elihu accused Job of self-righteousness. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.